Starting in 1924, Alonzo Pond and George Colley set out to do what all good archaeologists in the 1920s did: buy artifacts from potentially dubious sources. I'm kidding. Hopefully. They did also do excavations. Now, though, all of these artifacts are in the Logan Museum of Anthropology at Beloit College, making up Beloit College's French Paleolithic collection. This collection contains around 21,500 artifacts, all from the Dordogne region of France, which is an amazing site for Paleolithic archaeology, being the location of multiple very important Paleolithic type sites. The sheer size of this collection actually makes it one of the largest collections, if not the largest collection, of Paleolithic materials in the United States. Its main goal, back then and still now, is to be a teaching collection for students to understand archaeology, especially Paleolithic archaeology. Now, this collection spans over about 4 periods of the Middle to Upper Paleolithic: the Mysterian, which stretches from around 10,000 BCE to around 30,000 BCE, the Aurignacian, which stretches from around 35,000 BCE to around 25,000 BCE, the Solutrean, which lasted from around 20,000 BCE to around 15,000 BCE, and finally the Magdalenian, which was about 15,000 BCE to 8,000 BCE. Now, while all 3 of the Upper Paleolithic, Aurignacian, Solutrean, Magdalenian artifacts were made by Homo sapiens, the Mysterian artifacts were actually made more than likely, overwhelmingly more than likely, by Neanderthals, which, if you don't know, are a separate species or subspecies of human who lived in Europe and Asia between 240,000 and 40,000. So, how did Beloit College in Wisconsin get all of these materials? Now, originally, George Colley was a geology professor at Beloit, with Alonzo Pond having been a former student of his. In 1922, Colley brought up the idea to Pond about traveling to France to collect Paleolithic materials in order to create a teaching collection. This would be for the anthropology department, which would be made only a year later in 1923, and would have Colley switching from teaching geology to anthropology. Now, there were a couple of reasons that specifically France was chosen. For one, Pond spoke French, and so it was very helpful, and there are multiple correspondences in the archives for this collection where they praise Pond's ability to speak French. But also, French law at that very specific time was tightening up on private collectors who had any sort of French historical artifacts, and so a lot of collectors who had these Paleolithic French artifacts at the time were looking for people that they could sell to, so that their collections wouldn't get taxed and or seized. Because of this, Pond and Colley were able to start their expedition in 1924. Now, the majority of purchases were made between 1924 and 1925, collecting from all of the 4 previously described periods. But specifically in 1926, the goal kind of switched from purchasing to excavating. Beloit College purchased 2 sites in France, Rocher-de-la-Penne and Aubry-Cellière. Artifacts had already been excavated, I believe, from both and sold to Colley and Pond, and so both men knew that there were artifacts at these sites. The plan originally was to run these sites as Beloit College summer archaeology sites, where students could actually practice the archaeological methods they learned in class in a summer course. Of course, this is also the 1920s. Please keep that in mind. Both sites were excavated between 1926, 1927. Please keep that in mind. Because from a modern perspective, there were issues with how the excavations were handled. Pond was actually very diligent and pretty much ahead of his time, sheerly by recording everything he saw and everything he did at an archaeological site. But because of his record keeping, we know that in Rocher de la Pen, he admitted that if the team didn't find anything that they thought was specifically interesting, they just threw it to the side. And in Aubry-Cellière, he states very casually that when a part of the overhang on the site annoyed him and his team, they blew it up with dynamite. Obviously now this is a horrible archaeological practice, but again, we have to remember 1920s. The fact that they wrote down, oh yeah, we blew up this site with dynamite, was pretty ahead of its time. Around 1927 and 1928, though, the excavations stopped for a couple main reasons. For one, Pond kind of lost interest in the French Paleolithic artifacts and ended up shifting his interest south into French Algeria and the Paleolithic artifacts there. And secondly, the Great Depression hit, and Beloit could not afford to maintain these sites in France. And so eventually, Rocher de la Pen and Aubry-Cellière were sold. The main site from which the Mousterian tools in the collection were bought from was Les Moustiers in France, which is actually the type site for Mousterian tool technology. Les Moustiers is also in the Dordogne region of France, and is pretty close to Beloit's excavation sites of Aubry-Cellière and Rocher de la Pen. Now, Mousterian tools, like I said earlier, are heavily theorized to have been made by Neanderthals, not human hands. They are primarily lithics, a lot of hand axes, cores, discs. As you can see here, they have a very distinctive triangular shape where you see there's three very distinctive sides. As well, very disc-shaped lithics are common in Mousterian tools, kind of similar to this. This is a lot more teardrop-shaped, but you can see on this side it's very much a circular edge. And this kind of shape is almost a hallmark for Mousterian tool technologies. Now, the fact that these tools could be replicated and created in a very similar way over and over and over again, where we can find and see the patterns within the tools, shows a level of skill and precision which is incredibly interesting when we look at human evolution and hominin mental evolution. Now, interestingly enough, when Mousterian tools were being investigated by Francois Bordes, a French archaeologist who worked on Mousterian tools in the 1960s, he originally classified around 4 different distinct types of tools within Mousterian tools. Now, his explanation was that these 4 different types of tools were from 4 different wandering groups of Neanderthals who all had their own separate technologies and just wouldn't communicate to the other groups what those technologies were, and so they grew up independently. He also posited the idea that the differences in tools were based on seasonal differences and what was in the environment at what time. But another theory posited by later researchers suggested that instead it was a version of resharpening. And so you would have something like this, and the edges would start to get dull, and so you would hammer away at the tool and resharpen it, but while you're doing that, you're making it smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you see, eventually, multiple different types of tools. Now, there were a couple main sources where ordination tools were recovered, both lithic and non-lithic tools. A majority of the Logan Museum's collection comes from the site of Aubry-Cellier. Now, by the ordination, Neanderthals are out of the picture. We have made it from the Middle Paleolithic to the Upper Paleolithic, and now human hands are making these pieces. The ordination also helped kickstart a much more widespread use of bone within tools, especially as a result of the burin. Now, a burin is a tool mostly used for much more, fine carving, fine perforations in softer materials like bone. If you can see, there's that little point on the edge, and that would be used to actually carve or perforate bone. You can see its use in bone such as this, where it's been carved through with a stone burin. You can also see it in materials such as this, where it's been perforated through to make a bead. Now, some of these materials, especially, very careful, were actually bone harpoons. Now, they were also created using burins, and they were used to hunt much smaller prey from much farther distances. They don't really look like much, but when you haft them to a thin piece of wood, they can be used as a pretty good projectile, especially if you need to actually throw something a farther distance, and therefore you want your projectile to be a lot less heavy. We see this in the difference between fine bone projectiles and Mousterian points. You're a lot more likely to get these a lot farther than a Mousterian point. Interestingly enough, this actually tracks with osteological differences between Neanderthals and humans. A lot of Neanderthal skeletons show higher frequencies of blunt force trauma, often with similarities in injuries to professions like bull riding, where they are being thrown about and tossed about by something much larger than them, which makes a lot of scientists suspect that they were hunting at a lot closer distances than prehistoric humans were, and therefore getting a lot more blunt force trauma injuries. The ordination is also where we get a much bigger increase when it comes to art in the archaeological record. Now, there's always going to be debate as to what is or is not artistic expression, but we at least see a very dramatic increase in at least what we consider art in the ordination. There's a few artifacts here that really go to show it. Of course, we have this carved wooden piece. We have beads. Now, we don't know exactly how these pieces would fit into life within the ordination. We don't even know how the beads would have been arranged within dress or decoration, but we do have some interpretations. Up next, we have the Solutrean period materials, much of which come from Logerie Hout. I hope I'm saying that right. The Solutrean is very much characterized by a further development when it comes to stone points, getting much finer detail and a lot more precise work. In fact, some of these tools, such as this one, were so thin that many archaeologists wonder whether or not they were actually used for anything, or if they could even be used as projectiles for hunting. While the Solutrean doesn't make up a huge part of the French Paleolithic collection, it is a very important bridge that we have in the collection between the much more extensive Ordination and Magdalenian period materials. Finally, there's the very extensive Magdalenian section of the collection, made up of artifacts from Les Medellines, which is the type site for the Magdalenian culture, as well as Limuel, Laugerie Haute, and Rocher de la Penne. Now, Rocher de la Penne, again, is one of the sites that Pond and Colley excavated. Bone makes up a large part of these artifacts, with even more of these very finely carved harpoons. And one of the very special bone pieces that is from this collection is the back of this spear thrower. Now, this piece is from Laugerie Haute, and it would have been much longer. It would have been originally used to launch projectiles. So you would have been kind of holding it, have a piece of wood notched, a separate projectile notched into there, sticking outward, and you would have thrown it like that and put a lot more force into your projectile. And it would have put a lot more force and a lot more range into your throw compared to trying to throw one of these spears by hand. Now, another key detail about the Magdalenian artifacts are these little stone microliths, which are basically these kind of tiny stone flakes. Now, they're, of course, very small, but in terms of their functionality, they would have been kind of put together and arranged on a wood or bone handle and then used as instruments while you're holding the wood or bone handle and using the stone attached to them for cutting and slicing. And so you wouldn't cut yourself with the stone edges. And now to finish off our discussion on the Logan Paleolithic collection, we have what is pretty much like the crown jewel of the collection, you could say, which is the Rocher de la Penne necklace. The pieces of this necklace were excavated in Rocher de la Penne, not by Colley and Pond, but by the person who eventually sold the site to Colley and Pond. However, it was originally arranged by George Colley, and so he decided that it would be in this necklace arrangement. Now, of course, because it was found disarticulated, and Colley kind of was the one who decided how it was going to be arranged, we don't actually know if it would have been arranged like this at all. It probably could have been arranged in a whole variety of different ways, and so when Colley originally put it together, he was, very excited to show it off as the world's oldest necklace. It is no longer the world's oldest necklace, however, it is still very, very cool. As you can see, there are all these different pieces of bone and tooth that make up the necklace. There are shells. These 3 teeth are actually bare teeth, and then this kind of slightly different tooth is actually a lion tooth, which is really cool. Now, I'd like to thank Nicolette Meister and Nikita Warner for allowing me access to the Logan Museum and to the artifacts in the Logan Museum and the archival materials. I am truly happy for this experience and truly could not have done it without them. Thank you.